this is why I really do believe that anybody, especially a civil servant, is really well served by getting this thing straight and understanding this. Now, this is not saying, however, like you'll hear from some people, that, well, that's just a personal thing. It has nothing to do with my decisions. That's bogus as well, because what is going on over here is certainly going to inform what goes on over here. And Luther never envisioned, and I should clarify this as well, Luther never envisioned a wall of separation in Jefferson's choice of words. He didn't believe in that. And people who say, oh, separation of church and state, that's cool, that's great, Americans believe that, and so do Lutherans. No way. Two different things altogether there. What Americans believe, or what Jefferson believed by wall of separation was, hey, leave us alone. You go do your church thing, that's nice, and we're going to go do the important government thing. That's what we're all about. Leave us alone. Never the twain shall meet. That's not what Luther had in mind at all. Because Luther believed there's going to be all kinds of interaction between these things. Because the right hand is frequently going to point out to the left hand where it's blowing it, not doing its job very well. And the left hand is going to be there taking care of the church and very interested in seeing the church's task of proclaiming the gospel aided and making sure it goes forward. There's definitely a feedback between these. Remember, in Luther's day, when you had a heretic, Luther had no problem with the civil government stepping in and doing something about it, because he recognized that a heretic was also a threat to the civil order. So do something. There was definitely a huge interplay between these, and there still is. So we shouldn't be saying things like, oh, no nativity sets on church ground, on city grounds. That doesn't matter. That's not what we're talking about here with this distinction. So what we're really pressing for is a distinction, but not a separation. We're pressing for a cooperation, but not a confusion. But again, this will be picked up another time and run with a little more in detail. For now, you just need to kind of recognize there are these two realms, and God is doing these things. And the government is God's government, no matter what kind of government it is. Which is why, also one more little red herring to throw out here and really throw you, get you fired up, which is why Luther would say the citizen never has a right to rebel. Period. Which you think, oh, wait a minute. Our country started that way. And the conclusion, of course, you have to reach is that Luther would not have approved of the American Revolution and would not have endorsed it. So go home and chew on that one. Did you already? Good. Good. Yeah, because in fact, the revolution was wrong-headed. It was all self-serving. It was enlightenment-driven. And you cannot possibly justify the American Revolution on Christian terms. It doesn't work. And it always cracks me up to watch Christians try to do it. But you can't do it. It was a revolution. It was a rebellion. It was a revolt against legitimate authority. And the colonies had no business rebelling against the King of England. They were getting treated poorly, no doubt about it. Did that justify rebellion? No. Did it? Sorry. Oh, well. Another topic for another time. I know, that gets you stirred up. Wait a minute. But don't fear. Just because our country had an illegitimate beginning does not mean we're illegitimate now. Because God will use human sin, and then now he'll use these countries for his purposes. So are we a legitimate country now? Sure, no problem. Just because the beginning was bad doesn't mean it's bad in its present state. Which is also, incidentally, an important principle for things like even marriage and stuff. I don't know how many people I had showing up in my office for marriage counseling saying, Pastor, I realized I got married for the wrong reasons. My parents said I want me to marry. I married anyway. I married this non-Christian guy. And my parents are right. He's a loser. So I realized this is a bad marriage, so I'm going to get out of the marriage now, and this is what God wants me to do. And the answer, of course, is, I agree. It was a bad decision when you got married. But you're in it now, and this is clearly God's will for you now, because marriage is his institution. You're stuck. Sorry. And it's not. You can't change the past decisions don't negate the present realities in a sense. All right. Questions? You got them, but you're afraid to ask. Go ahead, Tom.
Well, we were talking a little bit earlier about like the need for wars.
Uh-huh.
If you're operating in the civil realm and you see something that's not right, or I mean, you go attack it. And
Yeah,
so,
you fix it. Deal with it.
well, I guess maybe what I'm doing is having an argument I'm supposed to go chew on later. But the solution. Was that right or not?
Well, was it right for the colonists to try to address the grievances? Sure. And was it right for them to try to work for justice? Sure. That's appropriate. But do you rebel against the government and take up arms and overthrow the existing authority? No. That's not right. So there are limits to how far you go. Peaceful resistance, passive resistance, sure, no problem. But to actively overthrow legitimately God-established authority, and it's established by God simply by the fact that it's there. Okay? And you can't do that. You see, to say that, well, God obviously doesn't want this guy to be ruling this country. Well, if God didn't want that guy to be ruling that country, he could take care of that easily enough. One simple heart attack and it's all done. And not hard for God to do that. It's the same thing with a bad marriage. You know, if God really didn't, how many people, God doesn't want me to be in this marriage, he doesn't want me to be unhappy. And I just counter by saying, God didn't want you in this marriage, you wouldn't be. You could fix your problem real easily. Just one death, and it's all over. You're not in the marriage anymore. Is that hard for God to do? No. So obviously, God wants you in this marriage. Yeah, John.
So, if you were a Jew in 1938 in a ghetto in Warsaw, you shouldn't resist Hitler.
No, you should. You have to obey God and not men. Acts chapter 5. And so you obey God and not men. And so when people are being killed unjustly, then you need to do what you can. Now, does that mean you actively overthrow the government? Not necessarily. But do you turn over your neighbor? No. And do you hide people who are, on the hit list for no good reason? Yeah, you might. So a Corrie ten Boom, she's doing the right thing. She's intervening. And if I'm a Jew in the ghetto, do I hide and try to get away and disobey the order that says turn yourself in? Yeah, I probably would. And I probably would try to take care of my family because I have a responsibility to care for them as well.
Corrie ten Boom.
Corrie ten Boom is the hiding place, this gal who hid Jews in her house and then ended up in a concentration camp herself because she did it, survived, and then wrote her story.
What about Bonhoeffer?
Bonhoeffer is a hard situation because Bonhoeffer had opportunity to intervene and perhaps take out this evil leader, this guy who was doing these things. And Bonhoeffer struggled with this because he knew what he had been taught, that you rise up against authority, and he knew he shouldn't, but he also knew you have to stand against evil. So for Bonhoeffer, it was a tough decision. He made the decision as an individual and tried to intervene to assassinate Hitler. Got caught in the plot and ended up in a German prison and ended up being executed. What's fascinating about Bonhoeffer is, did he say, this isn't just, I should be released? No way.
So he understood that.
He understood
Was that left hand.
the left hand, I'm going to disobey it because I believe God would have me do that. But the left hand kills me? Well, that's the left hand's prerogative. Oh, well. And he didn't claim special pleading or clemency or something. He was submissive to that. And see, that shows the right spirit. He's going to do what God calls him to do, whatever the consequences may be. He'll take them. And he also works out this issue of his disobedience to civil authority because he knows he's trying to be obedient to God's ultimate desire, and he has to come to terms between he and God in that issue as well. It's between him and God. And it's really not my business to say, well, Bonhoeffer did this or that, it was good or bad. It's each individual, when they get in that situation, is responsible for the decisions they make and the choices they make before God. That's another class for another time.
Well, yeah, but as far as legitimate government goes, don't we also title Satan the prince of this world? And
Yes.
even in the Old Testament, you have this view of evil entities being behind the opposing nations. of
Sure,
Israel, things like that.
sure. This world is broken, and Satan is running wild in this world, and that's why sometimes St. Paul can talk about the world in a very negative way. But when he uses the world in a negative way, what he means is the world opposed to God and set up in opposition to God. And yet, God's still ultimately in control, and the world is still his domain, and he is redeeming that world. John 3:16, God so loved the world, he wants to fix it. And even these demonic princes or leaders are still under God's control and are doing God's thing. Remember that Romans 13, the whole thing on being submissive to authority, was written by St. Paul, and who was the authority at that time? Rome. And most likely, according to the chronology, the emperor was none other than Nero, a real hero to Christians. And so it's just astounding to hear Paul saying these kinds of things. So it was not in an ideal situation. We had a Christian government. It was quite the opposite. Also remember Just to keep your perspective here, we're not dualist, light, dark, the yin and yang thing. God's in control. And Luther would like to talk about God's devil. God even uses Satan for his purposes. And so while Satan might think he's running the show, God's running the show. And all these things are working God's way. So Satan does something that is evil, tries to undermine things. God takes it, turns it, and accomplishes his purpose in spite of Satan's evil. And it's still evil, like we talked about, but God's still in control.
Maybe that's why it's a prince and not a king.
Prince of this world? Perhaps.
Would Luther have agreed that people leaving Europe then to come worship their religion here, outside of the government of Europe?
They're not fleeing all authority. They're just, in a sense, changing authority, and they have the option to do that, so they can. It's the same thing for you. So if you want to go become a citizen of the country, okay, you have that prerogative to do that. But see, you're not escaping all authority. You're just moving from one authority to another, in a sense. So there's a place for that. Okay, good. All right, so next chapter up then, where you only have a couple more to go here, we're talking here about